Hello, I'm Grace Karskens and I'm speaking to you today from Kari country on the beautiful New South Wales Central Coast. Today this is the country of Guringai and Darkinjung people, and I pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. Now the wonderful people at WestWords have asked me to read a few pages from my book. Here it is, People of the River, Lost Worlds of Early Australia. Now, this is a history of the beautiful and historical and I think mysterious Jirrabin, the Hawkesbury-Nepean River. It's in New South Wales and it surrounds the Cumberland Plain, which itself surrounds the city of Sydney. Now, because Australian history began way before 1788, the book travels back in time 50,000 years because that's when human history started on the river. And it's a long history of the Darug and Darkinjung people. But also the book's about what happened after settlers invaded this country from 1794, and who the settlers were, who they were, and how they changed this river landscape, or didn't. So one thing's for sure in this book, the river environment profoundly shapes both Aboriginal and settler history and their societies and their cultures and their spiritualities. So to understand human history, we really need a deep understanding of country. So I'm just going to read some pages from the introduction, and I think that will give you a good idea of what this book is about and where it's going to take you. Sometime in the summer of 1793-4, a small group of people, men, women and children, appeared on Jirrabin, the river. They made for Daulaba in the crook of the tributary stream Wyandotte, where the huge broad-barrelled eucalypts stood far apart and the dense viney undergrowth covering most of the river's banks opened out, clear and grassy. They cut bark and timber for shelters with their axes. They lit fires against the darkness, and they feasted on ducks and other wild birds they caught in the vast lagoons nearby. And soon, at various spots along that reach between Wyandotte and Werriling, the next river bend downstream, the strangers began breaking up the rich river soils with their hoes, uprooting yams and grasses. They scattered ears of corn and wheat seeds and dropped potatoes and peach stones. These strange plants flourished magnificently, and soon the news was out. More and more of these people arrived, some with guns, many with warrigal, large savage hunting dogs, and daramua, pigs, dangerous but tasty. And now they began to move into Duga, the thickly forested parts, setting fire to the bush, hacking the flowering vines and shrubs, and cutting the giant trees down to stumps, scattering seeds between them. They went upstream to the big lagoon at Yarramundi, over the river to Kurrajong, and downstream too to Buldura, then Guria, then Drumbaloa, where the great eel being Gurungadi tore a path through the stone heart of the mountains in the dreaming. They called Jirrabin by different names. Hawkesbury, though it sounded like Oxborough when they said it. Upstream, past the great cobble rapids, they named the river Nepean. Wyandotte they called South Creek, or the Creek. Buldura was known as Caddy. Drumbaloa was Portland Head and Sackville, or just down the river. And the reports of their guns echoed across the valley, the swamps and the forests. Pittalong! Pittalong! Well, who were these people, these newcomers? And who were the people watching and listening to them, first with curiosity, then with alarm, and finally fury? Those seem like simple questions, but they're not. The settlers who took the land on the river during the mid-1790s were there because of an extraordinary social and penal experiment devised half a world away in England. We think we know them, and yet these people don't fit our familiar image and ideas about settlers at all. The Aboriginal people who endured this invasion were there because of an even more extraordinary event in global human history: the arrival of their ancestors in Australia more than 65,000 years ago, and their successful expansion across the entire continent. But generalised understandings of Aboriginal people and culture can't tell us who these people were. Jarabin's people have their own history, culture, mythology, inseparable from their river country. But Jarabin has one of the longest known human histories in Australia. Aboriginal people have lived here for at least 50,000 years, their ancestors arriving well before the last ice age. They might have followed its winding course up from the coast, or maybe they walked down into the valley from the Blue Mountains to the west. Now, their history over these aeons were not timeless. It was astonishingly dynamic, marked by changing traditions and shifting alliances, and shaped by dramatic fluctuations in climate, ecology, and geography. And then, a mere 2 centuries ago, along came that new group of people, part of the larger reconnection that historian Tom Griffiths describes as one of the greatest ecological as well as cultural encounters of all time. The Hawkesbury-Nepean made modern Australian history too. Dubbed the Nile of New South Wales and the granary of the colony, it was the first successful white farming frontier and a proving ground for colonial agriculture and free-range grazing. Sorry, I'll say that again. And free-range grazing, meaning animals, sheep and cattle. The emancipist farmers who settled here were lauded for at last securing the young colony's grain supplies, and the river emerged as an important place on the settler map. Its rich, fabled lands nurtured the earliest patriotic colonial culture and identity, especially among the white native born, as they called themselves. None of this went uncontested. The first sustained frontier wars, a series of fierce and brutal clashes, erupted 3 times on the river between 1794 and 1816. The Hawkesbury-Nepean was the seedbed for settler expansion and invasion of Aboriginal lands to the north, south and west. It was the crucible of the colony and the nation that followed. So Jarabin, the Hawkesbury-Nepean, is where the 2 Australias, ancient and modern, first collided and were forever transformed. This book journeys into the lost worlds of both the Aboriginal people and the settlers of Jarabin, both complex worlds with ancient roots, intersecting, crisscrossed, cut through and connected by race and gender, class and culture, by loyalties and hostilities emerging and shifting over time. Jarabin ran through both of these worlds, these 2 early Australias, flowing on from Gondwana to the present and to the time to come. So by following the river and paying close attention to its history and geography, the deep past and the present can be reconnected and seen in one another's light. The Gundungurra speaking people of the highlands west of Jarabin have at least 7 words for rivers: large rivers, small rivers, crooked rivers, rivers in flood, particular river places. It's very likely that the other language groups of this region had similarly rich riverine vocabularies. Archaeologists have shown that Aboriginal sites are very rarely far from rivers, creeks or lagoons. How did Aboriginal people see and understand their waterways? A precious list of Aboriginal place names on the Hawkesbury and Macdonald rivers, transcribed by the Reverend John McGarvey in 1829, revealed some extraordinary insights into that lost Aboriginal river world. Many of the names refer to animals, birds and fish, like a word map of where to find them. Others are linked to parts of the body, arms for lagoons and creeks, necks for narrows and crossing places, eyes for lookout places. These names suggest that the river was conceived as a body, a living body. In some areas, there are places and names that convey the river's spiritual and sacred geography, the dwelling places of ancestral beings, zones of power and sorcery, and awesome creation stories from the dreaming. So the natural and human history of the Hawkesbury-Nepean and other East Coast rivers, they tell a different Australian story from the legends of wool and cattle industries, those two industries. It's a story about small farming on once dense river forest land, which did indeed have to be cleared acre by acre, tree by tree. It's a story about well-watered, fertile country and soils that did not blow away in the wind. A human story quite different from the mobile, transient, male-dominated world of grazing with its constant forward movement into new land. On the Hawkesbury-Nepean, settlers stayed put, intermarrying and intermingling over 6 generations or so. River histories and lore became intertwined as new waves of settlers moved to the rivers north and south, from the Hunter to the Tweed in New South Wales, and then north to the rivers of Queensland, and south from the Shoalhaven River down to the Bega Valley. Jerubin winds through this book, a serpentine, shining, more than human presence. It has its own history, but also reveals the human worlds that it shaped, the way it nourished and terrified and inspired and bewitched the peoples who live on its banks. There was a popular ballad doing the rounds in late 1780s England with the refrain, "To become a new people at Botany Bay." Of course, it was a sardonic song, naturally, turning on the very comical idea that thieves and rogues were becoming the founding citizens of a new colony. Here's one of the verses. "Let us drink a good health to our schemers above, who at length have contrived from this land to remove thieves, robbers and villains, and send them away to become a new people at Botany Bay." I'd love to know the tune. And yet, the insistent refrain hit the mark. Britain's felons, transported halfway around the world, were intended to become a new people. The founding of a convict colony in New South Wales was one of the most astonishing penal experiments in human history, and it was on the Hawkesbury-Nepean, Jerubin, that scheme for settling ex-convicts as small farmers was realised. The river became an emancipist stronghold and heartland, a bastion of old-style values and pleasures and politics, and the homeland of a new people, known as the currency, the children of the convicts, who called themselves the native born. But of course, these visions and hopes of redemption were built on the taking of Aboriginal land and the loss and suffering of Aboriginal people. Many settlers also assaulted Aboriginal women and took them as willing or unwilling partners, and they stole Aboriginal children to the intense and frantic grief of their families. Within months of the invasion, violence erupted and spiralled into atrocity and massacre. On other farms, there were gestures of friendship, sharing and cooperation, but in the end, even these were conditional upon that assertion that underpinned colonisation. This is our land now. Aboriginal people in the Hawkesbury-Nepean region now still deal with this every day. It's the knotted wound at the heart of the modern nation. Something about Jirrabin and Colomatta, the Hawkesbury-Nepean and the Blue Mountains, transcends the everyday and the material. It shimmers with mystery and poetry. The river and the mountains have always inspired people. The poets and storytellers and clever men in both settler and Aboriginal societies told of the river's mystical dimensions, ghosts and beings, sublime religious experiences, awesome supernatural forces, sacred law. They were all anchored in real places, in salt and fresh flows, in deep gorges and narrow necks, in water rushing over thousands of gleaming, rounded stones. Ordinary settlers sensed this in inchoate, not very articulate ways, but they saw themselves and their lives within the river's realm. They invested these riverlands with their own sacred and supernatural beliefs. And to Aboriginal people, those were obvious truths. Their world was inspirited, and all events had supernatural explanations. So this book begins at the beginning, with the deep history of Jirrabin before it had a name, before there were people. And it starts at one place on the Nepean, Castlereagh, today a strange half-world landscape where massive gravel quarries have destroyed the ancient river terrace and the old farmlands, but also revealed the earliest evidence of people on Jirrabin. Parts 1 and 2 of this book explore the lost worlds of Aboriginal people and settlers on the river, and they are long histories of occupation and adaptation, encounters and frontier conflict. Part 3 surveys the way early settler farming ran together with the forests, not against, and how river people coped with disastrous floods and the entangled, overlaid settler Aboriginal landscape that emerged. The ongoing politics of place, the way it was and still is powerfully shaped by abiding river geographies. Part 4, the last part, is structured around what mattered most to people, the aspects of their lives that made them who they were, families, cultures, and spirituality. This river story then moves from that single site of momentous discovery deep in the Nepean's gravel banks to explore the secluded river bends and the broad reaches, the terraces and river flats, the surrounding timbered highlands and the webs of ridge-top tracks, to encompass, finally, a vast, sacred landscape, the sandstone circle through which Jirrabin flows. Thank you so much, and I hope you enjoy the book.